The auction barn smelled of hay and old wood and something else Margaret couldn't quite name. Maybe desperation, or perhaps just the accumulated weight of too many difficult decisions made in one place. She sat on a wooden bench near the back trying to make herself small, which wasn't easy when you were the only thing being sold that day that wasn't livestock. The auctioneer kept glancing her way with a mixture of pity and discomfort written across his weathered face. Margaret had known this. Day would come eventually, when the medical bills piled so high they blocked out the sun, and when her aunt, the only family she had left, passed away 3 months ago, leaving nothing but debt and a small house the bank wanted back she had run out of options. The women's shelter had been kind but crowded, and the social worker there had mentioned this place with careful words and averted eyes. Not exactly an auction, she'd said, but a way for women in difficult circumstances to find work and room and board with families who needed help. Margaret had understood what it really was, though. Desperation meeting. Desperation in a place where pride couldn't afford to buy a ticket. She was 28 years old and felt about 108. The bruises on her arms and legs were fading now, souvenirs from her last attempt at trusting someone, which had ended with her running barefoot through a truck stop parking lot at 2 a.m. The white dress she wore was borrowed and too big, and she'd safety pinned the torn part near her hip. Blood had stained the hem from a cut on her knee, but she'd scrubbed it as best she could. She looked like exactly what she was, someone who'd been broken down to spare parts. The auctioneer cleared his throat loudly. "All right, folks, we've got one more item today," he said, and Margaret flinched at being called an item. "Young woman here needs work and housing, and she's willing to earn her keep with honest labor." He didn't mention the other part. The part Margaret had been forced to disclose on the paperwork. The part that made her damaged goods in the eyes of anyone looking for the usual reasons men looked at young women. She was infertile. The infection after the miscarriage 2 years ago had seen to that, and the doctor had delivered the news with the same tone you might use to discuss the weather. The auctioneer continued, "We'll start the bidding at $50 for a year's contract of employment." Margaret stared at her bare feet and tried not to think about how her life had become something measured in dollar amounts. The room was quiet, except for the shuffle of boots and the creak of old floorboards. She could feel eyes on her, but couldn't bring herself to look up and meet them. $50, anyone? More silence. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Even at $50, she wasn't worth it, apparently. "25 then," the auctioneer said, and his voice had gone softer with something that might have been kindness. Still, nothing. Margaret wanted to disappear into the floorboards, or maybe just cease existing altogether. Then a voice from the back spoke up, deep and calm and weathered like old leather. $1. The auctioneer looked confused. "Sir, the minimum we usually—" $1. The voice repeated. "That's my offer, and I'll pay it now in cash." Margaret finally looked up. The man standing near the door was probably in his late 50s, with gray threading through dark hair beneath a black hat. He wore a red bandana around his neck and a leather vest over a work shirt, and there was a weariness in his eyes that seemed to recognize the weariness in hers. The auctioneer sighed. "Anyone else?" The silence stretched out like taffy. "Sold then to Mr. Donnelly for $1. The man, Mr. Donnelly, walked forward and placed a $1 bill on the podium, then turned to Margaret. "Can you walk all right?" he asked quietly. "I saw you limping." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "My truck's outside," he said. "Take your time." He didn't touch her or hover or do any of the things that might have made her panic. He just walked slowly toward the door and waited, and Margaret found herself following him on unsteady legs into the bright afternoon sunlight. The ranch was 2 hours away through rolling country that turned golden in the late summer light. Mr. Donnelly, he'd told her to call him John, but she couldn't quite manage that familiarity yet. Didn't ask her questions or make small talk. He just drove with one hand on the wheel and occasionally pointed out landmarks. "That's Miller's Creek, where it crosses under the road," he'd say, or, "Those hills there are where the deer come down in winter." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but Margaret kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Men didn't pay for women, even just $1, without expecting something in return. But John Donnelly just drove and hummed quietly to himself and stopped once at a gas station, where he bought her a sandwich and a bottle of water, without commenting on how quickly she devoured both. The ranch when they arrived was modest but well-kept, a house that had been added onto over the years, creating a rambling structure that looked like it had grown organically from the land itself. There were outbuildings and corrals and a barn that leaned slightly to the left as if tired from years of standing. "I've got a spare room upstairs," John said as he helped her down from the truck without actually touching her, just offering a hand she could take or ignore as she chose. "It's nothing fancy, but the bed's comfortable and the door has a lock on the inside." That last part made Margaret's throat tight. He'd said it so casually, like of course a woman would need to lock her door like that, was just basic human decency instead of something rare and precious. The room was small with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the pastures. There was a quilt on the bed that looked handmade and a small dresser and a wooden chair. "Bathrooms down the hall," John said from the doorway. "Take whatever time you need to settle in, and there's no work expected today or tomorrow or until you're ready." Margaret turned to look at him. "Why did you bid on me?" John was quiet for a moment. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said finally. "Cancer. And it was quick at the end, which was a mercy, I suppose." He looked out the window at something Margaret couldn't see. Maybe the past. She always said this place was too much for one person to manage alone, and she was right. He continued, "I've been getting by, but just barely. And I could use help with the house and the animals and the 1,000 other things that need doing." "But $1, Margaret said. The auctioneer wanted to start at 50. John met her eyes then, and his were a faded, blue like old denim. "I figured if they were selling human beings like cattle, the whole thing was already wrong," he said. "Didn't see how paying more money would make it less wrong, so I paid what I had in my pocket at that moment and hoped it would be enough." He started to leave, then paused. "The paperwork said you can't have children," he said gently. "Want you to know that doesn't matter here, and I'm not looking for that kind of help anyway. And I've got 2 grown sons in Denver who've given me 4 grandchildren already, so that box is checked." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for a very long time. "So you just need help with the ranch," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I need help with the ranch." John agreed. "And maybe you need a safe place to figure out what comes next, and seems to me that might be a fair trade." The first week, Margaret mostly slept. Her body seemed to understand that it was finally somewhere safe, and it simply gave up all the vigilance that had been keeping her upright. John would knock softly on her door around noon with a tray of food, soup or sandwiches, or once a truly excellent beef stew, and he'd leave it outside the door and walk away. Margaret would wait until she heard his footsteps retreat down the stairs before opening the door and bringing the tray inside. She'd eat and then sleep some more, and gradually the bruises faded, and the cut on her knee healed, and the hollow look in her eyes began to fill in with something that might eventually become hope. On the 8th day, she came downstairs and found John in the kitchen making coffee. "Morning," he said without making a fuss about her appearance. "There's eggs if you want them, or cereal in the cupboard." Margaret made herself eggs and toast, and they ate in companionable silence while morning light filled the kitchen with gold. "I'd like to start helping," Margaret said finally. "With the work, I mean," John nodded. "Appreciate that, but there's no rush." "I know," Margaret said, "but I'd like to anyway." The work was physical and demanding, but in a way that made Margaret feel alive instead of just exhausted. She fed chickens and gathered eggs and learned how to muck out stalls without gagging. John taught her about the horses, how to approach them calmly and where they liked to be scratched and which ones were grumpy in the mornings. There was something deeply peaceful about the rhythms of ranch life, the way each day followed patterns set by animal needs and weather and the turning of seasons. Margaret found herself sleeping better and eating more, and occasionally laughing at something John said, or at the antics of the barn cat who had decided she was worth investigating. She learned that John had been a veterinarian before retiring and still kept his hand in by helping neighbors with their animals. She learned that he liked his coffee black and his eggs scrambled, and that he played harmonica on the porch in the evenings, though not very well. She learned that he'd loved his wife deeply and still talked to her sometimes when he thought no one could hear. And slowly she began to tell him pieces of her own story, about growing up, with an aunt who meant well but drank too much, about the boyfriend who'd gotten her pregnant at 26 and then disappeared when Sheesh